Johann Jack Unterweger was an Austrian serial killer who committed murder in several countries: Austria, West Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the United States. Initially convicted in 1974 of a single murder, Unterweger began to write extensively while in prison. His work gained the attention of the Austrian literary elite, who took it as evidence that he had been rehabilitated. After significant lobbying, Unterweger was released on parole in 1990. Upon his release, he became a minor celebrity and worked as a playwright and journalist. But within months, he resumed killing women. Unterweger hanged himself in prison after being convicted of 9 more murders in June 1994. Jack Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950 in Austria to Teresa Unterweger, a Viennese barmaid and waitress, and Jack Becker, an American soldier whom she had met in Italy. Some sources describe his mother as a prostitute. She was jailed for fraud while pregnant, but was released and travelled to Graz, where he was born. After his mother was arrested again in 1953, Unterweger was sent to Carinthia to live with his grandfather, who was known as a rough fellow who regularly used his grandson to help him steal farm animals. Unterweger was in and out of prison for much of his youth. He worked as a waiter, but between 1966 and 1974, he was convicted 16 times, mostly for theft-related offences, but also for pimping and sexual assault on a sex worker. He spent most of those 8 years in jail. In 1974, Unterweger murdered 18-year-old West German national Margaret Schaefer by strangling her with her own bra, for which he was convicted and sentenced to life in 1976. While incarcerated, he wrote short stories, poems and plays, and an autobiography, Purgatory, or The Trip to Prison, the report of a guilty man. That later served as his basis for a documentary. Several figures, including Austrian writer Elfriede Jelinek, have since questioned whether Unterweger actually wrote Purgatory. In 1985, a campaign to pardon and release Unterweger from prison commenced. Austrian President Rudolf Kirchlanger refused the petition when it was presented to him, citing the court-mandated minimum of 15 years in prison. Writers, artists, journalists and politicians agitated for pardon, including Jelinek and German novelist Günter Grass, along with the editor of the magazine Manuscript, Alfred Kollrich. Unterweger was released on the 23rd of May 1990 after the required minimum 15 years of his life term. Upon his release, Purgatory was taught in Austrian schools, and his stories for children were performed on Austrian radio. Unterweger himself hosted television programs which discussed criminal rehabilitation and worked as a journalist for the public broadcaster ORF, where he reported on stories concerning the very murders for which he was later found guilty. Law enforcement later discovered that Unterweger killed a young woman by the name of Blanka Bakova in Czechoslovakia, in addition to 7 other young women in Austria in 1990. Brunhilde Mather, age 39, Heidi Hammerer, age 31, Elfriede Schremp, age 35, Sylvia Zagler, age 23, Sabina Moitzel, age 25, Karina Aroglu-Skladki, age 25, Regina Prem, age 32, all in the first year after his release, and all garroted with their bras. In 1991, Unterweger was hired by an Austrian magazine to write about crime in Los Angeles and the differences between the US and European attitudes to prostitution. He met local police, even going so far as to participate in a ride-along of the city's red light districts. During Unterweger's time in Los Angeles, 3 sex workers, Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez and Peggy Booth, were beaten, sexually assaulted with tree branches, and strangled with their own bras. Back in Austria, Unterweger was suggested as a suspect for the sex worker murders. In the absence of other suspects, police took a serious look at Unterweger and kept him under surveillance until he went to the US, ostensibly as a reporter. The police observed nothing to connect him to the killings. Police in Graz eventually gathered enough evidence to arrest Unterweger, but he fled by the time they entered his home. After law enforcement agencies chased him and his girlfriend Bianca Mrak through Switzerland, France and the US, he was finally arrested by US Marshals in Miami, Florida on the 27th of February 1992. While a fugitive, he had called the Austrian media to try to convince them of his innocence. Unterweger was extradited back to Austria on the 27th of May 1992 and charged with 11 murders, including 1 in Prague and 3 in Los Angeles. The jury found him guilty of 9 murders by a 6-2 majority, sufficient for a conviction under Austrian law. Based on a psychiatric examination, Austrian psychiatrist Dr. Reinhard Haller diagnosed Unterweger with narcissistic personality disorder and presented his findings to the court on the 20th of June 1994. On the 29th of June, Unterweger was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. That night, Unterweger killed himself at Graz Carlow prison by hanging himself with a rope made from shoelaces and a cord from the trousers of a tracksuit, using the same knot that was found on all the strangled sex workers. Prior to his death, Unterweger had asserted his intention to seek an appeal, and therefore, under Austrian law, his guilty verdict was not considered legally binding after his death, as it had not been reviewed and confirmed by the court.
If you like that, then check out our Patreon, where for just $5 a month you get access to exclusive shows like Real Monsters and Playing with Bones with Amy Rose, along with early access to all our minisodes and ad-free access to the Weekend Update and It's Alive Alive! Not convinced yet? Well, head on over now and have 7 days on us. That's a 7-day free trial for all new members. That's It's Alive Alive Pod on Patreon. It's Alive Alive! All the guts and gore with none of the guilt. See you on Wednesdays, unless you're on Patreon when you get us all week long.